Well, so we come in week 20 to Cyril, Nestorius, and the Council of Ephesus. Um, a very exciting and interesting period in the development of Christian thought. Um, I've been thinking a lot about. We are now. We've had the Council of Nicaea, which we noticed had surprisingly little material directly about it, and the Council of Constantinople, from which the finished version of the creed we use at Eucharist came from, and also surprisingly little material from it. By the time we get to Ephesus 1, 431, about which we're going to talk today, um, there is finally a council about which there's really quite a bit more information. We begin to be able to see things more clearly. Um, there we have at the council definitely um, Cyril of Alexandria, one of the great figures in the history of Christian doctrine, and a writer of um, a great deal of material of all kinds. I'm sending you sheets on Cyril and on Nestorius. Um, so there's a great deal of material. Uh, Before we begin looking at Hall, let me say a few things just to make certain I say them clearly, so you have them in your mind as we think about this. And these are elements of the mix that you always need to keep in the back of your head, at least. The first is that during this period, from about the founding of Constantinople in the early 300s to through the Council of Chalcedon in 451, one of the basic ecclesiastical themes is a struggle between the archdiocese in Alexandria and the new patriarchate in Constantinople for primacy in the church in the Greek-speaking world. Historically and intellectually, you'd have to say, Alexandria had always been the primary place. Clement, Origen, Athanasius, now Cyril, these are absolutely first rank figures in the development of Christian doctrine, all from not just all at Alexandria, but all from Alexandria. Alexandria is tremendously important. Constantinople, which was a refoundation by Constantine. Off the top of my head, I can't remember exactly the year. I have it written down someplace. 314, something like that. No, it must be later because he doesn't conquer the east. Anyway, he refounds the city, and so it's really starting from nothing. Byzantium was a very small trading port of no account, and but of course it is the capital of the empire, and so there is a strain of Christian expectation which would make the capital of the empire the chief church. This is the basic thing going on in Rome in the West, is that the capital city is the main church. So there's a struggle going on there. We've noticed that a number of great figures from Alexandria's chief theological rival, Antioch, go to Constantinople and become the archbishop there. John Chrysostom is the first one. Nestorius, about whom we're going to talk today, is the second major figure from Antioch to go to Constantinople as patriarch. That's part of this power struggle between Alexandria and Antioch, of which everyone was very much aware. And it seems, that there are no letters surviving from the ancient world where the emperor writes to someone and says, boy, those Alexandrians are really bothering me, so I'm going to choose someone from Antioch. But that seems to be consciously in their minds, that the emperor would like to have the patriarch in Constantinople not be an Alexandrian because he's trying to balance things. It is a tremendously large topic how the Antiochene school and the Alexandrian school of biblical interpretation and theology differ from each other. And like everything else that we've talked about this whole 2 semesters, Everybody fights about every aspect of it. So I could tell you what I think, but that just tells you that, when I go to a conference, I fight with this group of people instead of that group of people. Um, so these are very convoluted and difficult issues to figure out, and it's very likely that we can never know really exactly what's going on because the sources aren't the right kind of thing to tell us that sort of thing, and because not enough of the right stuff survives. Um, I have a great admiration for Cyril of Alexandria as a theologian, and I have a great devotion to Cyril of Alexandria. You should know that before we begin, because that definitely affects the way I think about these things. I do have to say that of all of the figures active in this kind of Cyril and Nestorius secondary phase, or you could say Christological phase after the Arian controversy, I think, if favorite is the right word, that the person to whom I am the most drawn in many ways is Theodoret of Cyrus, who is mentioned a few times in here. He's not generally considered a theologian of the first rank. In an age in which everyone is fighting everyone else constantly, he doesn't really want to be involved in arguments, which kind of leaves him out of the whole thing, though lots of people want to fight with him. I think he, to a certain degree, is a moderate voice, as we will see Cyril can be too. His second letter to Nestorius is a moderate piece, and one of the great pieces of Christian theology ever produced. So anyway, just to let you know that a part of me would really like to talk about Theodoret. If we were going to do a course on Christology and focus on this period, I would bring out Theodoret stuff and we would work our way through it, because I think Theodoret's really wonderful. But the truth is that the way things worked, he was not a primary person, in the cut and thrust that goes on here. He was a secondary figure. And so he barely comes up in this, and so we won't really look at him. But it's just one of the things that makes me realize again that one of the things I want to tell you is that this course is designed to give you a sort of basic orientation in what's up in the early church and how things develop, what are the forces at work. And so when you pick up the Chalcedonian definition, or you pick up the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed, or any of these other things, you know what you're looking at, and you can see where it comes from and understand it better, and be able to explain it better to someone else, or be able to use your understanding of it to help other people come to an understanding of it. But it's a first step. After this, what you really need to do, of course, is begin to read in the original sources directly, and also read more deeply in the history. And certainly I've sent you enough book lists so that if you read those book lists, you would, no matter how old you are now, you would be very old indeed by the time you finish those book lists. And if you get to that point, email me and I'll send you more, because I've got lots. I can keep you going for multiple lifetimes. I'm nowhere near caught up with my own stuff, let alone with things that other people would find interesting. So how does this work? What's really going on? Cyril is the patriarch in Constantinople, and so one of the things he's interested in is protecting in Alexandria, excuse me. And one of the things he's interested in doing is protecting Alexandria's place in the world. So he's very suspicious of the Antiochenes and very suspicious of Constantinople getting too busy. So he's expecting to be hostile to them in some way. On the other side, of course, we have Nestorius, and the very first mentions we have of Nestorius, who was apparently a great preacher, is that Nestorius is very much, we'll see when we look at creeds, councils, and controversies, Nestorius is someone who's really looking for a fight. He thinks of himself as the hammer of heretics, and he goes out looking for heretics to hammer. So one of the great tragedies in this is that the people on both sides are the kind of people who are ready for a fight. And it makes me think, and this is worth thinking about just when you're thinking about human nature. I was talking to a professor at the college I used to teach at, who was a specialist in the Civil War. He said, the great tragedy of the Civil War, he said, almost nobody wanted to fight it. He said, except the people in South Carolina and the people in Massachusetts really wanted to fight it. He said, and they still do, which I think is, as someone born and raised in Massachusetts, I think that's really right. That they're still looking for a way to get at each other, and that's when that is the case, then things go differently than they would otherwise. Hall is very good on that. Hall singles out Cyril's second letter to Nestorius and says one of the things that's clearly going on here is that if Cyril is operating in an atmosphere which is not one of immediate controversy, that he's a brilliant man, a brilliant theologian and philosopher, and he's able to state his doctrinal convictions in a way which is clear and focused and helps everyone, both people who are drawn to those ideas and people who are hostile to them, understand not only what he's saying, but why he thinks it's important. In other words, understand not only, as you could say, the outside of the doctrine, but the inside of the doctrine. Not only what it says, but why it says it and why the doctrine itself considers particular parts of itself to be where the real importance lies. And the second letter to Nestorius is one of the brilliant compositions as far as that goes, in understanding what Cyril's really about. There are other things he wrote that are so very polemical, Greek word meaning warlike, right? They're so hostile to their opponents that it sounds almost just like abuse, and you don't get a sense of his theological convictions, which is what's really driving all of this on both sides. That's one thing that's going on, which is too bad. Another thing that's going on is 30-something years ago, when I was at Oxford, and I had a term with Bishop Callistus Ware, the great Greek Orthodox theologian, and he said, I can't do a Callistus Ware imitation, but it's worth learning how. He's a very idiosyncratic man, a wonderful man, and very saintly. He said, one of the most important things going on in the Nestorian controversy, or the controversy of Cyril and Nestorius, he says, is that one of the absolutely first-rank intellects in the history of the church, Cyril, is arguing with someone, he said, who is certainly of the second rank, he said, and if I were not a cleric and had to be polite, I would really have to say is probably a lower third-rank intellect, Nestorius. In other words, one of the great difficulties is that when Nestorius says or writes something, and a lot of what Nestorius wrote is lost, tragically. We do have one big work of his, but a lot of what he wrote is lost, and so we only kind of hear about it. But when Cyril read what Nestorius wrote, or heard about what he said, he could understand not only what was said, but sort of its implications. If you think that, then you are forced to think this, and if you think this, then that leads you here, and if you are here, then this is what you're preaching. And Cyril could understand what Nestorius's words really tended toward, and Nestorius not only could not understand Cyril, but Nestorius really was apparent, as far as we can tell, and I've become more and more convinced about this over the years, Nestorius is unable, he doesn't have the intellectual equipment to express himself clearly so that he's actually saying what he intends to communicate and actually hearing how it sounds to people who are listening to him. He's not well enough trained or intelligent enough to be able to really understand theologically what the words he's using mean in theology, and so therefore he's mystified by the way people respond to him, and he can neither explain why he's really thinking what he's thinking and why he's objecting to the things he's objecting to. He's just not, a good example is tennis, if you've ever, or ping pong, where if a world-class player plays against someone who's just picking up a paddle for the first, you can't have a game, right? Because the person hits it and then you go pick it up from, you pick the ping pong ball up from under the couch and then you throw it back and he hits it again, you pick it up from under the couch. That's all that you can do. You can't even, there's no back and forth because he's at such a higher level, or she, that you can't even enter into a sort of, rally with this person. And that's one of the things which I think is clearly going on in this. And it's tragic because if you read the Bazaar of Heraclides, which is the big work of Nestorius that survives, he writes it after he's in exile, after the Council of Chalcedon. And when the Council of Chalcedon comes out, Nestorius is thrilled because he says, this is what I always meant. This is what I was trying to say. But of course, it wasn't what he said, and there's no way to tell. And so the problem remains, because the first problem is it actually wasn't what he said, though he thinks it's what he meant. And also there's always the problem, as Bishop Callistos pointed out to me, that he didn't really understand the Council of Chalcedon. So he may have missed, it's, you don't really know how to take him. But there's I'm not partial to Nestorius, but there is a real truth in the fact that he's kind of a tragic figure because he's just out of his depth through this whole thing. He seems to have been a very good preacher. Of course, you can be, as seminary professors know, you can preach a great sermon without understanding much about theology, which is one of the great dangers the church always has to deal with, because sometimes the fanciest preachers really don't know what they're talking about. And for a while you can go along very happily that way. It all depends on what you're talking about. But when you get into trouble, as one of those great preachers who doesn't really understand theology, then you don't know what the trouble is, and it's very difficult for people to explain it to you. So, how does this work? Cyril is in Alexandria. He's already the bishop. Nestorius is appointed to Constantinople. Here on page 212 in Hall, the paragraph that begins near the top of the page. From the very start, Nestorius attacked heresy. We're going to look at this. Give me the earth purged of heresy, and I will give you heaven as recompense. Assist me in destroying heretics, and I will assist you in vanquishing the Persians. Because then, if the empire cleanses itself of heretics, then God will smile on it, and the empire will defeat the Persians in battle. Nestorius thinks he's going to go to Constantinople and clean it up. And so he goes there looking for a fight, and he, in some ways, it's the same kind of thing that Chrysostom was trying to do. But Chrysostom, first of all, being a good theologian, but also being a saint, a man of great saintliness of life, it's a different thing. Let's say something about Theotokos. Tikto is a word to give birth to, and theos, of course, is God. Theotokos is someone who gives birth to God. It's the Greek term that they use in prayer when Western Christians say Mother of God. As Hall points out, it's not exactly the same thing as Mother of God, but it's devotionally the same thing. Nestorius knew enough theology to know that to say Mary is the Mother of God is not strictly correct. Because, first of all, God the Son, to whom Mary gives birth incarnate, God the Son incarnate, right, pre-exists creation as well as pre-existing Mary. So, as a number of people point out in this controversy, you can't be older than your children, right? That doesn't make any sense. So, on a very literal level, when thinking about God the Son, it doesn't make any sense to say that Mary gives birth to him. On the other hand, if you take the Incarnation seriously and you think of the Incarnation as happening at conception, then the baby that grows in Mary's womb is the Son of God incarnate for its whole development. And so the baby to whom Mary gives birth is God the Son incarnate. That's not somebody else, and not just a human being that God the Son is going to kind of team up with later, right? Which would be adoptionism. She's giving birth to God the Son incarnate, so, what are you going to call that? One of the things going on in this whole argument and in the whole development of Christology is that the Christological mystery presents real difficulties for human language, right? There are truths about the person in whom the church believes that it's very difficult to state in human language. Um, so notice, first of all, there are two things involved here. One is the union of the human and divine in Christ. How are you going to talk about that? How are you going to think about that? And the second is the wholeness of the natures, the human and divine nature in God the Son incarnate, and how they actually are. How is God the Son incarnate fully human, and how does that work? And how is God the Son incarnate fully divine, and how does that work? Those are separate problems. Nestorius, in the end, is faulted both essentially on the union. He's thought not to think that they're united enough, and so when he talks about them functioning, it's as if they're independent. Here's God the Son over here going to the bank, and while the human Jesus waits in line at the car wash. They're too independent of each other to be imagined as being aspects or truths about the same person, the same individual. And so Nestorius is thought not to understand the union fully enough and to preach the union fully enough. That's what's basically going on here. But so Nestorius wants to say, so why would he do this? It seems that Nestorius wants to protect and this is the same religious motive that is pushing Arius. And I don't mean to, color Nestorius with a tar brush and say bad things about him by uniting him with Arius, but both of them seem to be motivated by a desire to protect the fullness of divinity. I wouldn't lean on that. Nestorius wants to protect the fullness of the divinity of God the Son. And he thinks he can't do that if he says these human things like being born really happened to him. He says you can't say God the Son is really born, only the human Jesus is really born. But once you start talking that way, then you end up, it's very difficult not to end up talking about Jesus as if he were two different people. Here's God the Son healing the man born blind, but here's the man Jesus from Nazareth getting nailed to the cross, as if they were two friends rather than, the same individual in different aspects. And Nestorius clearly never understands why the way he talks about Jesus bothers people. He really never gets it. This is a problem which continues up through the Chalcedonian Council and the Chalcedonian definition, and this is the problem that has left the Christian church with three main theological branches. The Church of the East, who are completely not associated with Nestorius, but who other Christians imagine as Nestorian. I mean, we can't even get into that problem, but they're not Nestorian, but they're imagined to be. The churches that people like us, Chalcedonians, called Monophysite, Armenians, Ethiopians, Copts in Egypt, the people we call Jacobites in Syria, the Syrian Orthodox, that branch, and then the Chalcedonian branch. This particular intellectual and devotional problem is what continues to divide the church to the present day. Theologically, it is a much more important distinction than the distinction between Baptists and Roman Catholics, which is, to my mind, I don't think ecclesiology is a primary religious reality in the way that the nature of Christ is a primary religious reality for Christians. And so I think this is the most serious division that exists in Christianity. Of course, we don't see it much in the United States, so we think, the real spread is like from the Pope, or maybe not this Pope, but from John Paul II all the way over to Jerry Falwell is, that's the theological spectrum. But that isn't really accurate, I would say. So Theotokos becomes a bone of contention because this is something that devout lay people in Constantinople in particular have recently been using prominently in their private devotion. This is exactly the period at which the saying of the Hail Mary is beginning. And the Hail Mary, Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. In Greek, the Mother of God word is Theotokos. And so when Nestorius gets his chaplain to go after people who say the word Theotokos, he's going after the most fashionable, most fervently prayed prayer in the Diocese of Constantinople. He walks into a problem that was not, as far as we can tell, present in Antioch, and he gets chewed up by it. So Theotokos is one of the things to keep in mind. On a level of literal technical reality, the Church has always recognized the fact that Mary does not give birth to God the way Mary gives birth to a human person. I mean, before the Son of God is incarnate in Mary's womb, there is no human nature that's going to be involved in this person anyplace, right? The human nature is created inside of her by the action of the Holy Spirit. But it is also true that because the human being who is engendered in her is the Son of God incarnate, the Son of God does go through the process of gestation and birth the same way any of us does. And so he is given birth to the same way we are. And it's that parallel part, not the difference part, that Theotokos is talking about. Let me make another point. As this develops, one of the realizations that Christian theologians come to is the fact that in order to be able to express the mystery of Christology, there has to be room granted for people to say things that are not, strictly speaking, philosophically true because of the difficulties, because of the inadequacies of human language to express. There's no claim here that, that saying Mother of God about Mary expresses the entirety of the Christological mystery, but it does allow you to say something which is true about God the Son, which is that he is given birth to by Mary in Bethlehem, which is an important thing. It says important things about the Incarnation that the Church wants to say. And so at the same time as recognizing that there is a difficulty here, the Church also says that you are allowed to assign properties to the divine nature of Christ, in Christ, that properly belong to the human nature. And you are allowed to assign properties of the divine nature to the human nature. This is called the communication of idioms. An idiom is something that belongs to you personally. Idios means yourself in Greek. So this is in classical Greek, this is my idiotic shirt. It belongs to me, myself, and it doesn't belong to anybody else. And I can lend it to someone else, but it's my shirt, And so an idiom is something that belongs personally to you. My wife, I don't have a car anymore. My wife has a car, and it belongs to her legally. She signed the thing. I was off someplace, so she signed the thing. So she legally owns the car, right? But if I'm driving the car and somebody smashes into me and he jumps out and says, "Oh my gosh, did I hurt your car?" The reasonable thing for me to say is, this isn't my car. The reasonable thing for me to do is to look at the car and see if it's hurt, because it's close enough. It's kind of functionally my car, even if it's not actually my car. And that's communicating an ownership that I do not actually have to me because of my relationship with my wife. In the same way that there is a truth in which when the Roman soldiers nailed Jesus to the cross, right, they nail his hands to the wood. And you can logically say, well, so what? They're not doing anything to God the Son. They're not grabbing God the Son, who is completely non-physical, and driving nails through the hands of God the Son, because they can't grab him and he's not. So that's literally true on one level, but on another level, those are the hands of God the Son incarnate. So the only way that you can hurt him is to hurt him, cause him physical pain, is to cause pain to his body, right? If I'm in a parking lot and you run over my foot and then jump out of the car and I'm saying ow, ow, and jumping up and down, it makes no sense for you to say that shouldn't bother your mind, or that shouldn't bother your soul. I just ran over your foot, so your soul's not involved, because of course I'm all part of one reality, and so my soul is bothered by the fact that you ran over my foot, because my soul or my mind or myself is feeling the pain. That's why I'm bothered by it. One of the insights that the church comes to as a result of this whole process is the church begins to look at Jesus and the relationship between the divine nature, God the Son, and the human nature, mind, spirit, and body, which he is born in, which he is engendered into in Mary, as working together as a united reality on the model, or according to the pattern of human nature itself. In other words, our experience of being human beings gets to be an interpretive tool that we use to understand what it's like to be Jesus. Right? And of course we can't really understand each other, let alone understanding Jesus. But the whole idea that God the Son wouldn't be able to, God the Son would be completely uninvolved when the hands, when the human hands of Jesus are nailed to the cross, we would rightly say is absurd. And that conviction is one of the things that is being expressed through the use of the word Theotokos. So it's not just that little old ladies in Constantinople wanted to say the Hail Mary. It's that there is a very important central Christological truth there, which is tremendously difficult to express. But one of the best ways to express it is by making use of this communication of idioms and through prayer. In prayer and in hymns, you're allowed to say stuff that you're not allowed to say when you're writing doctrinal definitions. And there's real strength to the truth that prayer and hymnography are better at expressing Christian mystery than formal doctrinal writing is. Formal doctrinal writing it's too restricted and too confined. Okay, well, this is taking too long just to get through. I want to have some time. I want to point out the fact that beginning here on 2:14, the distinction that Hall draws between Cyril's second letter to Nestorius and Cyril's third letter to Nestorius is very important. But the second letter is the one we're going to look at, and it's very important to see what Cyril really says when he's just trying to express his beliefs in the abstract, because this is where you really see him at his best. And the second letter of Cyril to Nestorius is an ecumenical document. It's accepted by the council as being an expression of what it truly teaches, and so therefore it is acceptance of it as a true statement of Christian doctrine is required for membership in the Catholic Christian tradition. So it's something everybody who's going to minister in the church ought to read and understand, and if you don't agree with it, then you need to belong to another group, because we're committed to it. Just to end with a quick note on the formula of reunion, that's another opportunity. You get the second letter to Nestorius, which is pacific and clear. The third letter to Nestorius, which is very combative and very extreme. He pushes everything as far as he can, trying to push Nestorius out of the church. And then the formula of reunion is when Cyril is trying to sort of back off and be accommodating because he's trying to gather things together. Now that Nestorius is safely pushed out of the church, he's trying to draw together, the church as a whole into with agreed upon formulae that everyone can feel comfortable with. So you get to see it. Cyril's an interesting case because you get to see him both when he's what my mother, the kindergarten teacher, would call at his best, when he's really behaving the way he ought to as a patriarch. And then in the third letter, you get to see him the way he is when he's kind of gone off the reservation and, the teacher's gone upstairs to get more paste and the kids are running wild. That's the way Cyril is in the third letter. It requires, and then the church is not wedded to the third letter to Nestorius. Okay. So looking quickly here now in Creeds, Councils, and Controversies, selection 215 on page 330. This is where you see it's an important passage to read. It helps you understand, again, like John Chrysostom, and I said this before when we talked about Chrysostom. If you are the emperor, the emperor of the late Roman Empire, early Byzantine Empire, you spend a lot of time in church. And it's a whole lot more interesting to spend a lot of time in church if you're listening to a great speaker than if you're listening to someone who really can barely spit it out. And Chrysostom clearly is chosen as patriarch because he is a brilliant speaker. And Nestorius reputedly was a brilliant speaker too. Unfortunately, he was not much more than that. He had a great voice and excellent diction and all that kind of stuff and was very fluent. But he clearly imagined himself as being a great theologian and had the misfortune not to be one. So he is going to come in and tell everybody what the right answer is and, clean up the whole area, and he ends up getting himself in trouble. I do feel sorry for Nestorius, but anyway. Let's look, in order to understand what's really going on here, before we look at Cyril's expression of, the union of natures in Christ, let's look at this selection 218, which is from Theodore of Mopsuestia, one of the great lights in the Antiochene school, which has a very different approach to things. As my original patristics professor said, the tragedy of human language is you can only speak one word at a time. So you can only say one thing at a time. So what do you do if you're the church and you want to talk about the Trinity? What you really want to do is you want to talk about God's oneness and threeness at the same time, but you physically cannot. You must either talk about oneness first and then threeness, or threeness first and then oneness. You've got to choose, and whichever one you choose ends up sounding as though you're emphasizing it. So theologians tend, even when they completely are trying not to, they tend either to sound like they're saying God is really one, let's talk about interesting ways in which he's kinda three, or God is really three, let's talk about interesting ways in which he's kinda one, because whichever you say first sounds like it's the most important thing. It's what people have in their heads when they listen to the whole thing. So how you go about talking about things is very important. So what's Theodore trying to do? Theodore says, if we can discover, this is page 335, selection 218, if we can discover how the indwelling is affected, he means God the Son present in Jesus, right? Indwelling already is a problem because it sounds to non-Antiochene ears, it sounds like there's this man Jesus and God comes and lives in him, which, if that is what it sounds like, you are imagining a picture of adoptionism. It doesn't seem to be what Theodore intends, but it certainly is the way he sounds to non-Antiochene people. How the indwelling is affected, then we shall know both the mode in which it is affected and also what makes for differentiation within that mode. In other words, how the human is still human and how the divine is still divine when God the Son is indwelling. Some people have asserted that it's a matter of essence, other that it's a matter of activity. But he says, no, 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 no. I don't want to say either of these things. He wants to say, well, first of all, yeah, he wants to say that it is here on page 336 in the paragraph that begins near the top there. If it's not a matter of essence or of activity, what remains? What other concept can we use which will not destroy its particular character? It's appropriate to speak of indwelling being a matter of good pleasure. God the Son desires and decides to be incarnate, so therefore God the Son is incarnate. Okay, there's an interesting point there. It is certainly, the church has always insisted that God the Son willingly does the will of the Father to become incarnate. So as far as that goes, the mainstream Catholic tradition would say, yes, absolutely, it is according to his will. But having just, and this, we don't have time to read the whole page, but having just talked about how God dwells in saints and how God is present in all creation, right? So this sort of universal picture. Then if you turn and you start talking about how God the Son chooses to be in Jesus of Nazareth, it sounds like, since you've just talked about God being everywhere, God is sort of choosing to be in Jesus of Nazareth, but maybe in a while he'll go someplace else. It doesn't sound as though this is a permanent relationship necessarily. And that's a real problem for the mainstream tradition, especially as it begins to develop this idea of our experience of being a human being the tool we use to understand this. No one would think, here I am, Paul Russell, right, and I live in Maryland. No one thinks that any of that is voluntary. I may like it or not, but I can't, this is one of the, we can't talk about this now, but this is one of the interesting things about like transgenderism and deciding that you're, a different sex, because in classical understandings of human nature, you are what you are essentially by nature, and you can't do anything about it. It's not something you have control over, and it's not something you can alter. I may like being Paul Russell living in Maryland, but I'm not Paul Russell because I desire to be. I'm Paul Russell because I am. Right? And so this, my soul or mind, or actually my soul and mind and spirit, are all Paul Russell's soul and mind and spirit, but not because they want to be, but because they were created to be. This is who Paul Russell is. This is what Paul Russell is. And it's not under Paul Russell's control, right? You do not belong to yourself. You were bought with a price, as St. Paul says, right? We are God's creatures, not our own. This is a very worrisome thing to talk about God the Son doing this by good pleasure, because so look at the very bottom. We can't read all of this, but if you look at the bottom paragraph here on 336, the bottom 7 lines, I guess, of the page, the argument as we have developed it so far shows why we use the phrase good pleasure, eudokia. And we have discussed the meaning of the term in full detail in order to establish this. We are now in a position to say, and this is where he gets in trouble, that just as it is in his good pleasure that God can be both near and far, God's omnipresent and ubiquitous, right? So too it is in his good pleasure that his indwelling operates, right? If God is operating in, if God the Son is operating in Jesus the same way he's operating in the world, then there's not enough difference between the incarnation and God just being the creator of the world, right? It begins to sound like Jesus is just a person whom God the Son particularly favors. He has a lot more good pleasure here than he does elsewhere, but he's everywhere. And, he's operating on the same model. That lack of distinction between incarnation and being the creator of the world is one of the breaking points that turns the larger church away from Theodore and the certainly Cyril of Alexandria away from Nestorius. So keep that good pleasure thing in mind, and then we will go back and look at oh gee. Okay, wait. We're going to skip 216, which I would like to talk about, and just go straight to 219, the second letter of Cyril to Nestorius, because I want you to have the contrast of these two in mind. I'm sorry that I don't think we're going to have time to do 216, but you can read this whole section and interest yourself. Okay. This is a polite, everything else aside, this is a polite letter. He's very polite at the beginning. This is before he's really kind of drawn his sword, right? You have to be very careful, he says, that not to offend the faith of even one of these little ones at the top of page 340, which is certainly true. The first rule of the preacher's task is to do no harm. You cannot scandalize the church, put a stumbling block in the way of the faithful. And so that's all true. Of course, you only say that to someone you think might do it. So it's not as though he's neutral, but so far he's being polite. Okay, so, and he's going to present himself, I think accurately, as defending the teaching of Nicaea and Constantinople. That's this paragraph on 340 that has the number 23a next to it. The Holy and Great Council then affirmed the only begotten Son, begotten of the Father. This quotes from the Creed. Okay. For what do we say? The next paragraph. We do not affirm that the nature of the Word underwent a change and became flesh, or that it was transformed into a complete human being consisting of body and soul. So it doesn't turn into a man, and then it isn't itself anymore. But rather this, that the Word, having in an ineffable, that's unexpressible, and inconceivable manner, personally united himself to flesh animated with a living soul, full human being, right? Not like Apollinaris. Living soul, physical self, the God the Son unites to himself, became man and was called the Son of Man, not of mere will or favor, directly disagreeing with Theodore, right? Nor again by the assumption to himself of a human person. It's not that Jesus is there and God the Word says, wow, that's a great guy, I'll join up with him. And that while the natures were brought together into the same university were diverse, that there was both one Christ and one Son. It's not that he's joining up with somebody, and it's not that he's teaming up, so there's still God the Son and his very good buddy Jesus from Nazareth. Not as though the diverseness of the natures were done away by this union. So not as though they're separate, not as though it's not like chocolate sauce and milk where you mix it up and you get chocolate milk, you get a third thing, right? But rather, just below the C on page 340, Godhead and manhood completed for us the one Lord and Christ and Son, by their unutterable and unspeakable concurrence into unity. So he's not going to say exactly how they're joined, which is good because nobody knows, but he's going to say what we're preaching is that God the Word is united in the Incarnation to a full human nature, not a separate human person, that they do not remain separate. They do not blend together so neither of them is left and you get something else. They are fully united, kath hypostasin, personally, as a person. We could say on the level of a person or on a personal level. So that one of the best ways to remember this is when Jesus of Nazareth says, I, gee, Mom, would you like seconds? Would you like seconds, Gigi, as he's sitting in his high chair? Yes, Mom, I would. It's both the divine nature and the human nature saying that at the same time. There is no, yes, I, the divine nature, would like it. No, I, the human nature, want to watch TV, right? There's only one I. That's a very important theological point. There is only one I in Jesus. There is only one person. God the Son incarnate as a human being is one person. So any picture, and think about this as we come along, any picture that has imagines Jesus thinking in his head, gee, human me would like to go to the movies, but divine me knows I have to stay here and be subservient to my father and mother. That's a false picture of Christ, because you've really got, in the movies, devil on one shoulder, angel on the other, arguing. That's a false picture of Christ. There's only one eye. And exactly how this works, he says, we're not going to say. Okay. Continuing on in the middle between C and D with and at the end of the line. And thus, although he subsisted and was begotten of the Father before the worlds, God the Son is already fully there before the world's even created, let alone Mary gets pregnant, right? He is spoken of as having been born also after the flesh of a woman. Not that his divine nature had its beginning of existence in the Holy Virgin, not what Nestorius is objecting to, or needed of necessity on its own account a second generation after its generation from the Father, right? But at the top of 341, second line, not that, but forasmuch as the Word having for us and for our salvation, personally, again, on the level of person, united to himself human nature, came forth of a woman, for this reason he is said to have been born after the flesh, because there's only one person, and Mary gives birth to him in a stable in Bethlehem and puts him in a manger, and it's God the Son lying in the manger as a baby, incarnate as a baby. And there's, that's what that's what that person is. Who that person is Jesus of Nazareth, God the Son incarnate. What that person is God the Son incarnate and a complete human nature. Okay. For he was not first born an ordinary man and then the Word descended on him, adoptionism, but having been made one with the flesh from the very womb itself, we would say from the moment of conception. He is said to have submitted to a birth according to the flesh, as appropriating and making his own the birth of his own flesh. So, important in terms of salvation, fallen human nature, which is completely corrupted through sin and through living in a sinful world and having sinful people act upon it. Fallen human nature is recreated because at the very moment of conception, that's God the Son born as a human being, the entire range of human existence is gone through by the incarnate Son. So the entire experience of being a human being is cleansed and recreated through the incarnation. That's the salvific aspect of the incarnation, and that's one of the things why it's because of the union of the natures that humanity is considered to be healed. Remember, Gregor of Nazianzus said, that which is not assumed is not healed. The logic there is clearly the same as Athanasius and as Cyril. It's the union of divine and human in Jesus that cleanses, purifies, and recreates human nature. So it can't happen later in Jesus' life, because then what about babies in the womb? Are they not, their stage of existence is not involved? No, that's not acceptable, right? It has to be the whole thing. And he goes on in the next paragraph to say that I guess we have to talk about this because this is something they fought about all the time. Look at this first paragraph at 31, about a third of the way down. In like manner, we say that he suffered and rose again, not as though God the Word suffered in his own divine nature. We don't, either stripes or the piercing of nails, exactly what I was saying. They're not driving nails through God the Word. It doesn't work that way. But we say he suffered and died, not because God the Son is, there's not just a two, Father and Spirit. I'm having trouble doing it backwards. Father and Spirit, while Christ is in the tomb. God the Son isn't dead like that. But we say it's him For as much as that which had become his own body suffered these things, therefore again he himself is said to have suffered them for us. For the impassible was in the suffering body, the same way our souls, which are technically, um, non-graspable, right? It wouldn't make any sense if you're if you're a dissident and you're grabbed by the Nazis and they're beating you in prison, and you thought to yourself, well, this really doesn't bother me because after all, my soul is completely unaffected. Then that's not a sign of great enlightenment. That's a sign that you're beginning to lose your grasp of reality, because as a matter of fact, all of you is affected, because your entirety is affected by what happens to you physically, right? Because we are double beings, physical and spiritual, in the same way that God the Son incarnate is a double being, physical and spiritual. His physical is like our physical, but his spiritual is mind, spirit, soul, plus God the Son, right? So he's got the same mix, physical, non-physical, but it's not exactly the same ingredients. Okay, which is another explanation for why we can. Anyway, the logic of that continues, but it's very important to see that if you're thinking the way Gregory Nazianzus thought, or if you're thinking the way Athanasius thought, or if you're thinking the way Cyril thought, then the way Theodore talks about, God the Son was really, with his good pleasure, he was involved with, with Jesus of Nazareth, not the way he's involved with everybody else, though of course he is also involved with the way of everybody else, that it begins to sound like Jesus is just sort of God the Son's best friend, and that's not enough. That's not enough for the Catholic tradition, and that's very important to understand. So when we get back to trying to see at the end how Cyril tries to pull everything together, look at page 362 as a kind of representative section of this formula of reunion, right? Begin with the first paragraph that's just above the midpoint of the page, 362. Sorry, I've only got 3 minutes here. We confess, therefore, our Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God and perfect man, consisting of a rational soul, that means, human mental part, and a body begotten of the Father before the ages, as touching his Godhead, the same in the last days for us and for our salvation, born of the Virgin Mary, as becoming his manhood. So certain things are true about him divinely, certain things are true about him humanly, the same as of one substance with the Father, touching his Godhead, of one substance with us, touching his manhood. He's like us as a human being, he's like God as divine. This phraseology is going to come back at Chalcedon. For of two natures a union has been made, and because of this we confess one Christ, one Son, one Lord. In accordance with this sense of the unconfused union, they're not mixed together, they stay themselves, we confess the Holy Virgin to be Theotokos, the one who gives birth to God, because God the Word became incarnate and was made man, and from the very conception, there's conception, united to himself the temple taken from her. The temple is the human physical self in which the Word dwells. As to the expressions concerning the Lord in the Gospels and Epistles, we are aware that theologians understand some as common, as relating to one person, and others they distinguish as relating to two natures, explaining those that befit the divine nature according to the Godhead of Christ, and those of a humble sort according to his manhood. This is going to be something that Chalcedon also fights about. For example, when Jesus is weary, as he is in the Gospels, and when Jesus is thirsty on the cross, he says, I thirst. God the Son, as an entirely and only spiritual being, is incapable of feeling thirst. He's incapable of being thirsty because he doesn't have any way to drink anything, and he doesn't have any need for liquid. Because God the Word incarnate is a human being, he is able to thirst. So that is his human nature thirsting, right? When the woman with the issue of blood grabs a hold of Jesus and is cured by touching him, she's touching his clothes, which touch his body. It's not his body that heals him. It's the fact that it is the body of God the Word incarnate. It's the divinity in him that heals her. So it's accurate to say that because he is God the Word incarnate, he heals the woman by touch. Because he is God the Word incarnate, he feels thirsty. But you can't say, oh, that's the human Jesus feeling thirst and God the Word has nothing to do with it, because it's his body that's thirsty, right? I mean, I'm thirsty now. My soul is not thirsty, but my soul is affected by the fact that I'm thirsty. If I don't drink anything for long enough, my soul is going to be permanently affected, because I will die and my soul will not, right? And so will not have a body to live in anymore. You cannot say the body of Jesus is completely not involved in the healing of the woman with the issue of blood. After all, it is in his body and by means of his body that Jesus is walking through the village on the way to the synagogue leader's house to heal his daughter. And it's because he's got a body that she's able to grab him at all, right? We're not going to solve the Christological mystery today, especially because we're already a minute over time. But it's important to understand where the difficulties lie. If you understand why someone like Cyril or Gregor of Nazianzus or Athanasius or the Council of Chalcedon doesn't go for what Theodore of Mopsuestia is saying, then you are a very long way toward understanding, first of all, why the argument happens, but also what the church is going to end up preaching, right? Where next time we're going to get to the Council of Chalcedon, where they're going to try to do as much as they can of laying this out in detail. And you need to understand what the problems are that they arrive realizing they have to solve. And that's really what we've tried to do today, is to lay out the difficulties and the insights that are going to be used as tools to try to express an understanding of the mystery that is going to be satisfactory, not ever completely correct or a complete encapsulation of the truth, but good enough and maybe as good as human language can manage. Thank you for your time.